Today, we're going to sort of talk about the end of that time in Egypt. This week's parsha is Beshalach, and one of the things that we didn't talk about was the request of Joseph not to have his bones remain in Egypt. He asked to have his remains brought to the land of Israel, not in the land of Canaan, where his father and his grandfather and his great grandfather and his other ancestors certainly were buried. And in the Talmud, it discusses sort of the logistics of how did this work and what did it mean and how did they know, and that's what we're gonna look at today. So it's from Masechet Sota, which we've actually learned quite a bit of. It has a lot of great narrative stuff. Can everybody see this okay? Thumbs up? Amazing. Okay. It has a bunch of interesting narrative stuff. So we learned a good chunk of Sota, but Sota generally, the subject matter, the named subject matter of Sota is this accused woman of adultery, and the rituals attached to that as described in the Torah, and this tractate is all about that subject. And we're not talking about that in any way, shape, or form, but that's sort of the broad context of the tractate. But we're going to talk a little bit, as I said, about Joseph and the journey of his bones, if you will. Can I get a volunteer to start us off in this first paragraph? Anybody?
I'll do it.
Great, thanks, Mila.
It states further in the Mishnah, who to us had a greater burial than Joseph, as it was none other than Moses who involved himself in transporting his coffin. The sages taught in the Tosefta, come and see how beloved mitzvot are to Moses, our teacher. As at the time of the Exodus, all the Jewish people were involved in taking the plunder from Egypt, and he was involved in the performance of mitzvot. As it is stated, the wise in heart will take mitzvot.
Wonderful. Okay, so there's a lot of things happening here all at once. So here it says, right, who to us, right, had a greater burial than Joseph. Now this is a reference to something that had happened in the Mishnah. So it's a quote. And Rabbi Steinsaltz here has sort of given us a little bit of a flavor by saying, or by sort of giving the reason, which is like, who had a greater burial than Joseph, right? In a culture like Egypt, where burial was so important, and we have such descriptions of from Abraham onwards of burial, burial is something that of paying attention. And the mitzvah that they're making reference to, as far as I see it, is really the rituals around death and taking corpses to the graves and things like that. Those things are really, really powerful. One of the mitzvot that comes that is referenced elsewhere in the Talmud and other places is called a met mitzvah, right? That if you find a sort of an abandoned body, whoever's closest, you take not advantage, it's not the right framing, but you take the opportunity to treat that deceased person with kindness and respect. And here we're seeing that here with Joseph. Okay, so that's the first thing. That's the context, the question, the challenge, saying, who had a greater burial than Joseph? And Rabbi Steinsaltz telling us, right, Moses, right, what auspicious nature to have Moses involved with the burying oneself. Yeah, Bob.
So from this, should we extrapolate to modern that a significant burial is important?
I think in a lot of ways our culture has shifted. I mean, this is my opinion, right? Which is to say that I think as a culture we decided that the sort of egalitarian nature, that we're all human in death, supersedes the idea that some people are truly more important than others. That being said, it was really quite meaningful for me to visit Rabbi Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, his grave in Tzfat when I was in Israel last. Like that was really powerful and meaningful for me personally. And so there is like a tension. I think there's a tension there between honoring people who we think were important, as well as this sort of quality of we're really all just human in life and in death, and we shouldn't be treated differently. But I think that in part is a cultural context, right? Depending on where you live and what culture you live around, that it might make some that has adjusted over years. That's my opinion. I don't know if other people have a thought they want to share.
What I'm thinking of is when you go to the great cemeteries in Europe, or you go to Lakeview Cemetery in Cleveland, where Garfield's tomb is, people who were, quote, important have these massive burial vaults and buildings and huge monuments to themselves, which I guess is not a Jewish custom. So is this implying that the burial service should be extravagant?
Yeah, so I think.
Welcome to Zoom. Enter your meeting ID followed by pound.
Then Nelson, that's coming from you. I think, again, I think it's about time and place more than anything else, which is I think our culture has shifted away from that, Jewish culture. When I lived in Israel, just using Israel as an example, I remember living around the corner from a really beautiful and I mean by context extravagant burial site for a Maccabean priest, right? So a priest in the Second Temple period. It would seem that seemed pretty extravagant as opposed to just a gravestone. So I think.
Also,
yeah, please, Sheila.
if Bob, if you go to Queens and you go to the cemetery, I should remember the name, Montefiore. I think it's the new Montefiore. Anyway, the Lubavitcher Rebbe's grave. If you want to see what goes.
Oh. All right, we lost Sheila there for a sec, but
on there. It's I'm sorry.
It's okay. Sheila, try again.
That cemetery, I mean, that's an experience. And Jeremy, if you ever are in Queens and can see it, you talk about graves, a large building, and the whole process. You come in, they want you to light a yurtzeit candle, put in a kvittel, they change into the croc shoes so that, you know, the land is, and they wear a gartel. I mean.
Yeah, so I think the takeaway is that I don't think it's a one size fits all. I do think in general, in most Jewish communities and customs, there's a strive for egalitarianism, but it's obviously contextual, right? Where important people in a community might elicit greater attention, but that's usually by the people who are following them, not necessarily their own personal request.
I have a question though. I mean,
wait a second. Let me come back to you because Ron and Bill have their.
Because this is.
Yeah. So Ron and then Bill.
Well, first of all, I was thinking that as far as burial goes, and I'm thinking, I hope I have the right Hebrew term, hidur mitzvah. You make a big deal out of it, and you embellish it and blah blah blah. That's one thing. But once you're dead and buried and you've done the mitzvah, I think it's a lot more important to do mitzvot in that person's name, or mitzvot that person did, than it is to go visit the grave again. That's just an empty shell there at that point.
So I think that's a very reasonable approach. Bill, Sheila, and then I want us to learn our some Talmud. Yeah, Bill.
Yeah, I just have a question. I saw Rabbi Schachter, a Rabbi Emeritus, who you don't know, his burial in Israel, in Jerusalem, was in in a building, which I thought was very, very strange. And they dug it. It looks like there's dirt inside the building, unless the building was built into a hillside. You know anything about that?
I don't personally know much about it, but Sheila, looks like you do.
It's Har HaMenucha, and I think that was for protection, maybe out of protect. If you also notice that if you read Lifsa's lips, she was saying, "Am I going to be on top of him?" Because in Israel they don't have that much room, so they bury on top of one another, and that place is very crowded already.
Yeah, but it was like in a building. I saw that was.
Yeah, but I think it's a sort of a shelter. I noticed that too, Bill.
Yeah, so I don't know
It's
much.
a very interesting thing.
Yeah, so I don't know much about the shelter or the building. We're going to see here in our text the reference of a crypt, and so again, I do think that, again, I'm not an expert in the laws of burial, so this might require me to do a little bit of homework, but I do think that some of this is cultural mores, right, in terms of like being in a building or in a crypt versus not. Generally, custom today is burial on the ground. I'm not an expert in how that works in Israel and the various mountains that people are being buried in outside of Jerusalem, for example. There's certainly customs around that. Some of those are theological reasons, some of those are cultural reasons, and so there's a couple of things happening there. I'm going to pause us because
this is getting back to this.
Great, please do.
Okay, we are making an assumption. I like the way the sages say that because Moses was carrying the coffin out, that he wasn't engaged in anything else like taking any plunder. That's an assumption. We have no evidence. They're just, it's like they're trying to
The evidence for the plundering.
what do you call this? It's a backward
compliment.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So right, the next piece is we learn about Joseph has this great burial because Moses is involved. And we know that Moses really cares about mitzvot and burial because, as sort of the reference being that as the Israelites are leaving Egypt, they're taking gold and other kinds of things, and Moses ostensibly is not involved with that. And the evidence is this line from Proverbs: "The wise in heart will take mitzvot." So it's not really a reference to Moshe specifically, but sort of saying, okay, if Moses cares about mitzvot and a wise and hard person is mitzvot, they're the one who's not plundering. Again, this is narrative as opposed to trying to like prove something from the text, but it tells us a little bit. And the reason why I thought this would be interesting for us to study today is that it's telling us a little bit about what the rabbis thought were important when it comes to burial and mitzvot and relationships. And so let's see more what the Gemara says, and it's going to talk a little bit more about Moses. Can I get another volunteer to read versus the Gemara asks? And while that volunteer comes together, I want to point out this word minayin, which we talked about last week, which is the question: from where do we know a source comes from? How do we get proof, right? And in this case, the answer is amar or amru, because it's not a source. It's not like a quote, and it won't be a quote until later on in the learning. Okay, can I get a volunteer to read this paragraph? Anybody want to? Okay. Oh yeah, Bob, please.
You're muted, Bob.
I think I'm open now, am I?
You're good now. You're good now.
The Gemara asks, and from where did Moses, our teacher, know where Joseph was buried?
Let's pause. I know he's just started reading, but like, that is an interesting question we had not yet asked, right? If we think temporally, there are some significant amount of time from Joseph's death until Moses's life. And so there's a reasonable question here of asking, how did Moses know what the deal was? All right, keep going.
The sages said, Sarah, the daughter of Asher, remained from that generation that initially descended to Egypt with Jacob. Moses went to her and said to her, "Do you know anything about where Joseph is buried?" She said to him, "The Egyptians fashioned a metal casket for him and set it in the Nile River as an augury,
Augury.
so that its water would be blessed.
Wait, let's pause there for a
Moses-
second. Let's
okay.
pause there for a second. So a couple of things happening at once. One is we have this character, Serach, the daughter of Asher, who represents institutional knowledge. Whether or not this individual or the community at large, the lesson the rabbis are making clear, where Joseph was buried was known by this individual, known by the community, that there was institutional knowledge that Joseph was not to be buried in Egypt, and it was that his location would be remembered. And so we have this now little vignette in which Moses goes to Sarah and says, do you know where he's buried? And she says, the Egyptians put him in a metal casket and put him in the Nile as an augury, that's Rabbi Steinsaltz, so that the water would be blessed. Meaning to say, he's a totem of some kind. He's an amulet for the river itself. He represented plenty, and so therefore the river should also be plentiful. All right, Bob, keep reading.
Let's see.
Moses went right here.
Moses went and stood on the bank of the Nile. He said to Joseph, 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 the time has arrived about which the Holy One, blessed be he, took an oath saying that I, God, will redeem you. And the time for fulfillment of the oath that you administer to the Jewish people, that they will bury you in Eretz Yisrael, has arrived. If you show yourself, it is good, but if not, we are clear from your oath. Immediately, the casket of Joseph floated to the top of the water.
Okay, so Moses goes to the river and sort of like, shouts out at the river and Joseph, who's somewhere inside, and says, hey, Joseph, to his corpse in his casket, it's time to go. We're here to fulfill our promise. And if you're not here, we're absolved. Our oath is resolved, right? God promised, and we're here to fulfill it. If you don't show up, we're not gonna worry. But then we see immediately this metal casket of Joseph floating on top of the river, which challenges us to ask all sorts of questions, including what we're going to see in the next line. Do not wonder how iron can float, but we're not there yet. All right, Ron.
I'm going to make up my own midrash that Moshe was the reincarnation of Joseph, because Joseph was buried in the river and Moshe was taken out of the river.
Nice. Right, there is a custom, a Jewish tradition of Gilgulim, of reincarnations. I think that's fascinating. That's a nice midrash. Any other thoughts on this paragraph before we go and see how this story ends? Well, we know how it ends, right?
Let's read them on and then go back to it.
Yeah, fair enough. Can I get another volunteer to read this next paragraph about not wondering how iron can float? Somebody want to read?
Yeah, I'll read.
All right, thanks, Bill.
And do not wonder how iron can float, as it is written in the verses describing how Elisha was able to cause iron to float. Well, a ship floats and it's made out of iron, but I gotta sit up. But one was felling a beam. The axe head fell into the water, and he cried and said, alas, my master, for it was borrowed. And the man of God said, where did it fall? And he showed him the place, and he cut down a stick and cast it in there, and iron floated up. And are these matters not inferred fortiori, whatever that is? And just as Elisha, who was mere student of Elijah, and Elijah was a mere student of Moses, as Elijah studied the Torah of Moses and was able to cause iron to float before him, all the more so it would float before Moses, our teacher himself.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bill. So here we have this, the Gemara knows that our question is going to be, how can this metal casket float on top of the water? That's ridiculous.
No, it's not.
Then we have a story, a reference, right, to the story of Elisha, one of the prophets in the book of Kings. And in the scenario there, right, an iron axe head fell into water and was lost. And Elisha was able, using effective, some sort of godly magic, if you will, effectively, and the iron floated up. And we had this reference that Bill read, the a fortiori, which is Latin, which is outside of my expertise, but in Hebrew, you might have heard the term kal v'chomer. And what this means is, if this is true, then that is true, right? It's an analogy. We're comparing if this is the case to the next, which is to say, if Elisha was able to make iron float, and using sort of the transitive property, Elisha was a student of Elijah. Elijah was a student of Moses, right? In the sense that Elijah studied Torah of Moses, according to Rabbi Steinsaltz here. That if Elisha was able to do it, kal v'chomer, all the more so, Moses would have been able to do it, right? Which is to say, how could the iron casket float up? Because that was within the power of Moses, and we know this because Elisha was able to do it too, and therefore Moses was able to do it.
Now, why can't a casket float if it was airtight?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly could. My guess is it probably wasn't. But second of all, I think, we've created this scenario, right? There's no evidence that Joseph was buried in a metal casket. All we hear is that he was bones. And the rabbis are trying to figure out, how did this even work? Like, where did these bones live? How did they go? And you'll see in a second, the Gemara is going to offer a different version of the story, right? So this is just one version of the story as dictated by the Gemara. All right, before we move to the second version, Sheila, I know that you had some, Nelson and then Sheila. Oh,
Right.
you're muted, Nelson.
To me, it's not amazing that the casket floated. It's amazing that it didn't float. It suddenly emerged.
Mm-hmm.
And that's Moses's amazing power. Because if it floated once, it would float always. I mean, unless it was caught or something, but.
Yeah, my sense is that that the idea is that it sank to the bottom because it was not otherwise visible. But I think your point is well made, which is it isn't just that it could float and maybe, right, and we have this sort of evidence from this other story that it could float or that it was airtight, as Bill said, and you made a reference to ships, right, being made of iron before, although not exactly the same. But that it, as you said, Nelson, is that it showed up right here. Moses goes to the river and says, Joseph, it's time to leave. And Joseph appeared. Joseph was ready to leave Egypt. Okay. Sheila, I was going to come to you because you said you had something you wanted to say before you wanted to wait.
Well, that was about, the assumption about that Moses was more of a tzaddik because he didn't plunder. He was looking for the grave. But what could have happened, I mean, if you want a logical explanation, I think the whole thing is stupid, but the coffin got stuck in some area. I mean, that's how we would explain it today. The coffin got stuck among some area and it was not noticed. And suddenly there was a storm and the leaves or whatever surrounding it, the junk that was surrounding it and the thing, it appeared. He noticed something that was not noticeable to anybody else.
So,
and if you want an example, what happened in Australia, this little piece of radium that was lost. Do you know what I'm talking about?
No.
Oh, in Australia, there was a big truck and a piece of radium, which was very, very dangerous. It was about this big. I don't know. I can't see myself on the screen. Something is going on. And they were wondering how they were going to find this because it was dangerous.
Mm.
And they found it was like a needle in the haystack, they described it. And that's what this is, because they were looking for it. Nobody else would have noticed it.
Yeah,
and here this was just not noticed.
I think all of these are good possibilities. I want to ask a different question, which is, what are the rabbis telling us about Joseph and Moses and the Israelites? What is not the science of it or how does it work, not the logistics, but what is the purpose that the rabbis are telling us the story? What is important to them that we're hearing from the story? Yeah, Ron.
Well, before we go there, Moses was the only one who noticed the burning bush. He's the only one who noticed where the casket was. Same issue.
Right. So we have a sense that Moses really is paying deep attention. I like that. Let's I want to hold my question because I want to read what the other version of the story is, and then I want to see if we can then sort of pull out the differences. So here's the second story. Rabbi Natan Omer. So we got a different version of the story according to Rabbi Natan. Rabbi Natan says, Joseph was buried in the crypt of kings. Moses went and stood by the crypt of kings and said, Joseph, the time has arrived about which the Holy One, blessed be God, took an oath saying that I will redeem you, right? So the same sort of ritual being done. The time for fulfillment of the oath that you administer to the Jewish people, that they will bury you in Eretz Israel, has arrived. If you show yourself, it is good, and if not, we are clear from your oath. At that moment, the casket of Joseph shook among the caskets. Moses took it and brought it over to himself. Okay, so we got two things that are similar and different, right? So first of all, the location of Joseph was known. And in this case, he was buried amongst Egyptian power. And second, we've got the same ritual. And third, when his presence is requested, Joseph's bones, casket, whatever, made itself known, right? So in this case, the previous case, it floated in the water. In this case, the casket sort of shook, and Moses was able to identify which one. Why do we think the rabbis are telling us this story? What are they telling us about Joseph in this Talmud? Yeah, Nelson.
One thing is that they got the right casket, and Joseph wanted to make sure they got the right casket.
Yeah, right. The rabbis are telling us they didn't just take any bones. They were sure that it was Joseph's bones. Great. What else? Other folks?
And he was buried by it said he stood the crypt of the kings. That's inferring that Joseph was buried among the kings. On the other hand, each king had his own pyramid, his own little.
Yeah. I mean, my sense of history is that the really big pyramids were really quite a long time ago, and I don't have a sense of where that would be in the context of Joseph and this story. But certainly, right, he's not buried in Goshen, where all the other Israelites were probably buried, right? He's buried with Egyptian power, right? Maybe he had his own little mini pyramid or something like that.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, certainly.
I got a question. Are there any currently, have the people dug up any graves or anything from the Jews from Egypt?
Well, so right, the question of the historicity of Exodus is under debate. There's a great series of lectures that I heard, certainly some papers by a scholar at JTS, whose name is escaping me at the moment, who argues that the Exodus was merely the Levitical family and no one else, and they told the story, and other people sort of joined them in the storytelling. It became a story about everybody and not just the Levites. Take that if you wish. So the question of whether it's historical or not is an interesting question. And if it was, then perhaps we could find evidence, graves, and things like that. Certainly, my sense is that's not the case. There certainly was an Egyptian Jewish community for many hundreds of years, of which I'm willing to hope, I guess, that those cemeteries still exist and are accessible. I don't know that. That's not something I'm knowledgeable about. But sort of the evidence of this time period doesn't remain to today. All right, we've got now this story. We've got the evidence that Moses has taken the bones of Joseph with us, right, with the Israelites on their way out of Egypt, because as we were told at the beginning, Moses is this real, careful mitzvah, paying attention to person. And the Gemara asks an interesting sort of next question, a thing that we should be paying attention. It sort of draws our attention to an interesting circumstance, which is, in all those years that the Jewish people were in the wilderness, these two arks, one, the casket of a dead person, Joseph, and it just says Echad shel meit, right, of death, and one, the Ark of the Divine Covenant, Echad shel Shechina, right? We have these two aronot, these two arks, one of death and one of the Shechina, right? The Ark of the Covenant. They were traveling together, and a passerby would say, "What is the nature of these two arks?" They said to them, "One is of a dead person, and the other is the divine presence." And the passerby would ask, "In what way is it the manner of a dead person to travel with the divine presence?" And we'll read the response in a second. So here we have the scenario, and I think a reasonable one when we say we've got these Israelites, thousands and thousands of people who are traveling, and they're traveling, eventually with the tabernacle and all these things, and they've got these arks. One of them has Joseph in it, and the other one has the Ark of the Covenant, right? This sort of physical manifestation of God's presence. And they ask a really interesting question, right? Imagine someone saying, "What is going on there?" On one level, we could say these are non-Israelites who are not aware of the story, and they're encountering the Israelites and discovering what's going on. But I also think it challenges us to say, perhaps, 15 or 20 years later, when you've got new Israelites who were born in the desert and are asking the question, what is going on over there? Right? For 40 years, they're in the desert. There's time for people to grow into it. They said in response, this one is deceased Joseph, and it says, this one fulfilled all that is written in this one. Therefore, the argument the Gemara is making is that Joseph fulfilled everything in Torah, in the Ark of the Covenant, the 10 Commandments. That Joseph is sort of a human manifestation of Torah's completion, of fulfilling all of Torah, and therefore it's appropriate that they live side by side. Rabbi Steinsaltz saying this at the end. What does this tell us about what the rabbis want us to think about Joseph? Like we read weeks and weeks ago, and all sorts of things about the kind of person Joseph was or was not. We talked a number of weeks ago about he was sort of this like annoying little brother who would not stop bothering his older brothers, who was eventually sold into slavery. It wasn't like he was constantly complaining about them. And yet here we're being told, no, he fulfilled all of Torah. This is a bit of revisionist history in my mind. The rabbis are really, really wanting us to say Joseph was this really quite perfect character, when certainly that was not the case. Any thoughts on this? Okay. The Gemara asks, and if Moses had not dealt with the burial of Joseph, would the Jewish people not have dealt with it? Meaning to say, Moses goes and gets the bones of Joseph, but had Moses not done that, wouldn't the collective people take responsibility for fulfilling the obligation made before, that Joseph's bones would not remain in Israel, in Egypt? But isn't it written?
One thing they have to know that the promise was made.
That's certainly true, right? We have to know that the promise was made. Let's assume that for the time being. So here it says, would the Jewish people not have dealt with it? But isn't it written after Moses died, and the bones of Joseph, which the children of Israel brought up out of Egypt, they were buried in Shechem, right, in the book of Joshua. Meaning to say, we already know Moses doesn't make it to Israel. So even if he was to fulfill the obligation by taking him out of Egypt and burying him in Israel, he could not have done it on his own, because he didn't make it into the land of Israel. So we already know that the Jewish people took some form of responsibility to get it buried, which indicates the Jewish people completed the burial of Joseph. And furthermore, if the Jewish people had not dealt with Joseph's burial, would his children not have dealt with it, Joseph's children? And isn't it written in the same verse, and they became the inheritance of the children of Joseph? As Joseph was buried in Shechem, which was then given to his descendants. Therefore, the question arises, why did Joseph's descendants initially leave the task of his burial to the Jewish people and Moses? Why wouldn't Joseph's actual descendants take ownership of this responsibility? Ron and then Sheila.
I'm not positive, but I'm pretty sure there's mention of Joseph's bones in Joshua, that they did take him across and bury him.
Yeah, that's this right here.
Okay. Yeah. See, I guess I wasn't listening close enough.
That's okay. Right. Which is to say, right, we know that the resolution happens. We know that he makes it into the land. Yeah, Sheila.
There is sort of a very sad thing that is being implied in all this. Where were the children of Joseph and any of the descendants?
Yeah.
Maybe we say it's like, why did Joseph's descendants initially?
Oh, she froze. I see you now, so I'm going to come to you next.
In other words, we just, all right, there was Ephraim and Manasseh. I mean, maybe they were the ones who did help in the end, bringing him to Shem.
Yeah, I mean, it becomes clear, right, that the story shifts at the end of Exodus into the book of Exodus to not be about one specific family per se, right, and shift to be more about peoplehood, and that narrative, right, expanding out, because we would presume, right, Abraham, we are primarily focused on Abraham's second son, and Joseph's second son, and Isaac's second son, and Jacob's whatever son Joseph was. He was pretty young, right? And so we would say, if the story were to continue in that way, we would say, okay, one of Joseph's descendants would be something that we follow. But that isn't what happens. And part of that, I think, is the broader narrative shift, right, towards peoplehood, even though we do have individuals. And so we are left with this really interesting question of what role does Joseph's children have, if any? I think it's a great question. Nelson.
Well, this is kind of a complicated question. I've never heard a discussion of this. And it's that Christians claim that Jesus is the Messiah because he fulfills all kinds of prophecies. And so they've got one book that they match against another book, and they say the two books match, and therefore Jesus is the right guy. And here the Jews are doing something very similar, but the rabbis lived long enough to know that argument. They lived into the Christian era. And I'm just wondering if one of the reasons this argument lost favor is that it just raises too many questions in the Christian mind.
This one.
Yeah.
It's interesting, right? Certainly the rabbis of the Talmud and the editors of the Talmud would be aware of Christianity's growth and power. Certainly they would be aware of it. And so it's interesting, and look, I'm not an expert in Christianity, so I'm going to know my lane here. It is interesting to then say, we have similar language here. How do they speak to each other? And perhaps this is an attempt to be defensive, to say, no, we got our own guy who fulfills all of Torah. We don't need yours, right? We had Joseph. He's fine. He did okay, right? We don't need some other guy. It's an interesting. I mean, I certainly don't know the answer, but as a really interesting question, and it does remind us that the Talmud is an edited document. It's not a journal. It's not a law book, right? It's this edited document meant for future generations to review and to study. And it's good to then ask, why is this here? And I hadn't thought of that one, and I'm glad you added it. That's really interesting. Any other thoughts? So let's read a little bit. Let's read a bit further. Does anybody want to read? The Gemara answers this question about Joseph's children. Anybody want to read? Yeah, Sheila, please.
If we're desperate, you can always call on me. The Gemara answers, they said, leave Joseph for others. It is more of an honor for Joseph to be buried by the many than by the few, and therefore it is better that the Jewish people be involved in the burial. And furthermore, they said, leave Joseph for others. It is more of an honor for Joseph to be buried by one of the great men like Moses than by the lesser ones like us.
All right, pause. So here we have two potential answers, right, about what Joseph's descendants may have said. On one side, they say, right, I assume that it's like the Moses category is saying, leave Joseph for Joseph's descendants because it's a greater honor to be buried by the many than the few. Right? Better for Jewish people and the descendants to be involved rather than just a few people. And an alternative answer, and the reason why it says furthermore is this phrasing of the two. They said, leave Joseph for others, which is to say Moses and the ones who sort of the high power, quote unquote, important people. It is more of an honor for Joseph to be buried by one of the great people like Moses than lesser ones like us, us mere descendants. And here it's so clear, it's clear to me in the sense that we have, Bob, you made the comment earlier on it, right? Like, is it better to be buried, with having important people buried separately, or everybody all the same? And I think here is asking a very similar question. It's framed as answers, but they're questions, which is, what is our relationship to people who have a great impact? What is our role in honoring them, if any? Right, it goes both ways, right? It's we learned this in rabbinical school, right? Which is like, the burial is not for the dead person. I mean, like, there's some theology to it, fine. The burial and everything that happens afterwards, Shiva, is for the people who are mourning. It's not the dead person, but that person's dead, right? And again, regardless of what theology or belief system, all of which is totally fine. I'm not suggesting you shouldn't believe whatever you believe about the afterlife or whatever, but that there's a role for us as the living people who cared about this person to play in our relationship with them and the burial and stuff like that. And I think the rabbis are asking a similar question here, which is, how do we as the living pay respect for someone we cared about? And here we have different answers. All of us should come together and bury them in honor because all of us together should play a role, and that is a greater honor. Or that the people, here they use the framing of great versus less, of greater and lesser, or we could say closer or farther. It might be another framework, which is to say, maybe really this honor is really in the focus of intensity, of closeness. I'm not suggesting an answer. Just I think this is asking that these questions of how do we honor people who are deceased, and the people who we care about. Yeah, Sheila.
Well, generally the feeling in Judaism is that the more people that are there, the better. I know my husband used to complain about people who wanted graveside burials. Nobody knew her. And it turns out the funeral's in the funeral home and there are an awful lot of people there. Oh, I didn't know my mother knew so many people. So that the same thing with the wedding. This is not supposed to be a private party. I mean, there are times when you need it, but you want to have as many people to share in your simcha, to share in your sorrow, to share in any mitzvot. I think that's the Jewish way.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's here, right? That's represented here by one of these views, certainly, right? Which is that it's a great honor to have as many people as possible present. Other thoughts?
So we often feel sorry for for a funeral where very few people are present.
Yeah, that's certainly true, right? We're saddened by the like. We wish that more people had been present to honor this person. So certainly, our culture is encouraging us to say better, better to be present than not.
And the Zoom, thank God, has enabled more people to be involved in a funeral.
For sure, right? We now have technology that allows us access that we didn't have before. I know that I have been able to attend funerals and shivas and things like that I wouldn't have been able to participate in. People I care about, relationships I care about. Certainly true. Any
What happens when
please,
the people
yes.
who pass away who are very elderly and they don't have their friends have predeceased them?
Yeah. I mean, certainly that is a phenomenon in our world here. Absolutely, right? Where relationships that we had, we some folks outlast them, and find themselves alone at this moment, right? Absolutely, that's true. Any other thoughts? There is a couple of other interesting things in here that I wanted to come down to, which is this statement by Rabbi Chama here that I wanted to draw out. So we have this whole story of the burying of Joseph in Shechem. Why Shechem? Rabbi Chama, the son of Rabbi Hanina, says, he was kidnapped in Shechem, and therefore we return his lost body to Shechem. Right? There's sort of like we've hit full circle, right? And then we've got the Gemara challenges that, what have you. But this is the part that I think is so fascinating. Rabbi Chama Rabbi Hanina, the son of Rabbi Hanina, says, anyone who performs a matter but does not complete it, and then another comes and completes it, the verse ascribes credit to the one who completed it as if they had actually performed the entire act. Due to the fact that the children of Israel completed Joseph's burial, the Torah ascribes them credit as if they had performed the entire act. Rabbi Chama is sort of mirroring that famous quote from Pirkei Avos, right? Which is you're not required to complete a task, but you're not required to desist from it. And here in the same way, right? Which is if you really put in the effort and you're really working to complete a matter, but you're unable to, and another person does, everybody gets a little bit of credit, having played their role and completing the thing. And I think I think that's a fascinating concept. Ron, I think I saw your hand up.
You beat me. You beat me to the Pirkei Avot, so I was done.
All right, fair enough.
But this is true. We always say this about a lot of things, that just because he was the last one in, he gets all the credit, although he didn't. It's like the one who puts the last stitch in the garment. It's attributed to him when all the other people really did it. So this is something that applies to a lot of things.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes both ways, and part of it is by way of intention, which is, you're right, someone who completes the task gets credit for all the process beforehand. But I also think that this is an encouragement to say, right, Moses gets credit too, even though he didn't finish it. He brought it as close to the finish line. It's not what the text is saying, but I think that this, in a literal sense, but I think this is broader, which is to say that, if you did as much as you could, you get some credit for that. You're part of the process. Nelson, I saw your hand up.
Well, I was saying the opposite. The last one who does something sometimes gets all the blame.
Okay.
You see that in football penalties. The second one who hits is the one the first hit draws the attention of the referee, and the second hit gets punished.
The last one is the one who always gets credit or
Blame.
blame. Yeah,
Or,
I mean,
or,
this is-
or the one who got the penalty at the end of the game last Sunday.
Yes.
And it's because of him they lost the game, not all the other plays before that.
That's right.
you have this with a kid. The kid who winds up with the ball and is caught by the parent after the glass has been broken. He gets blamed. He isn't the one who made the hole and threw the ball at the window.
Right, whoever's holding the evidence. Yeah, so I think right, we have a couple of narratives happening at once in this section of Talmud. On one level, we have the story about the relationship we have towards the deceased, one of honor and respect and fulfillment of responsibility, right? The whole taking of Joseph's bones into the land, right? We have Moses, who is, according to the Gemara, participating in that process, as opposed to taking all of the wealth from Egypt with them. The second story narrative we have is Joseph's, I always say the word wrong because I always read it more than say it, like the posthumous, right, where he said after death, whatever that, however you pronounce that word. Posthumous, thank you.
Posthumous.
Thank you. Right, his posthumous desire to go to the land of Israel and not be buried in Egypt, right? So much so that we have two stories in which, when given the opportunity, he rises out of the river in his metal casket, sort of bending the natural law, or that his casket rattles so that Moses can identify. In either case, it's clear that Joseph wants to leave Egypt and be in the land of Israel, in the land of Canaan. The third story we get is the relationship, again, we have with the deceased in terms of the children of Joseph, the Moses, the honor, what does it look like for Joseph's bones to travel with the tabernacle and things like that. Each of those tells us sort of our place. How do we hold this person in our emotional space, if you will? And then finally, the story of Rabbi Chama in terms of the task that we take on when other people have fulfilled it, have done their part. And I'll just give you an example. When I worked at I worked at a synagogue in Pittsburgh, and one of my friends here in the DC area was the rabbi there before me. And I have a friend who's now the rabbi there after me. And one of the things I realized in reflecting on my experience was how much effort and labor that I put in benefited from the hard work of my predecessor, and how much of that hard work that I put in helps my successor. And that each of us are sort of handing the baton to the one that comes after us. And that each of us gets some form of credit. Yeah, maybe the guy at the end, the person at the end gets some more credit because it's public and they finished it. And that's sort of what we get here. But that everybody as part of that process is, even if it's not known, it's still getting sort of credit, if you will, in the mystical sense. And so I think part of what we're learning in all of this is just, right, the generational piece, right? We had Joseph, we had Moses, we have Moses' descendants, or Joseph's descendants, and we have us. And then each of the tasks get handed down across the generations. And I think that's part of the subtext of this section. And I think an important lesson for us in terms of our role in life, our role in community, and knowing that we probably can't complete it all on our own, but that we have to hand it off to others. Yeah, Nelson.
There is, I think, in Pirkei Avot, the idea that our job is not to finish the task, but to make some progress.
Going.
Keep going, yes.
Right. Yeah. The text says that we're not required to complete it, but that we are required. We can't avoid it. We have to play some role. Right. We're not allowed to desist from it. But that's exactly right. That we have a responsibility to play our part, to do our job, to move things forward. And I know this is part of my own personal theology, and my own worldview about the relationship between humans and God, and the telos of the universe and things like that. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a part of what we got going on here. Any other final thoughts before we end for today? Well, I wish
another camp. And that's how great cathedrals got finished
I'm sorry, say that again.
in Europe.
I didn't hear that. Will you say it again?
That's how the great cathedrals of Europe got finished. They were
Yeah.
begun in one era, and hundreds of years later, somebody else finished them.
I think that's a great example, right? Certainly, major construction projects over time, right, aren't completed necessarily in one generation, but handed off to others. Absolutely. Bob, did you have something you wanted to add?
The baby's asleep.
Oh, yes, she's still asleep. All right, with that, I wish all of you a Shabbat Shalom. Today's Thursday.
Shabbat Shalom.
And
Yasher Tov.
I'll see you guys all next week.